a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, our next guest has written a book called This Teeming Mess of Glory. Think about that for a moment. It doesn't all sound perfectly harmonious, and that would be the reality for so many of us in our lives. Matthew Pullar has been wrestling with identity, with creation, and the divine presence of God. I guess one of the most effective ways to describe what is often so chaotic is through poetry, and Matthew Pullar's new book is called This Teeming Mess of Glory. It's been shortlisted for this year's Australian Christian Book of the Year, being announced very soon on the 21st of August in Melbourne. Matthew's joining us now. Hey, Matthew, welcome along to 2020.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Matthew, you say the things that shape our identity can even be a little like things like a dormant volcano. Give us an insight here into the magnitude of your thinking around these things.
Well, I suppose one of the starting points for the book, This Teeming Mess of Glory, was visiting the place where I grew up. So when I was 1 year old, my family moved to Mount Tamborine in the Gold Coast hinterland, and I spent probably my first 6 or 7 years there and then moved to the Gold Coast before moving to Victoria. And so I grew up around a place that had been shaped by this dormant volcano, and so many of my memories of the place, the environment is so significant to me. I remember the way it shaped my imagination, the way it shaped my sense of connection to God as my creator. And so I wanted to explore the ways that not just our human relationships, but also the places where God puts us shape who we are.
Always fascinated by poets, because poets love metaphors, connecting things like, volcanoes. You like to also use metaphors around the depth of the ocean and migrating birds. And you're trying to paint a picture in all of that, in talking about metaphors that actually might align with some of the messiness of our lives.
So I suppose, one of the things that I see as my job as a poet is just to keep my eyes open for the ways that God might be speaking through the everyday things. The ways that, the Bible talks about the revelation of God that is made known to everyone through the things that he's made. And Christians, I think, can then redeem that we can bring our understanding of who Jesus is to fill out that picture that we get from the natural world. So I love always being on the lookout for those little hints that God gives us of who he is and what he's doing in the world.
This is the interesting thing, because poetry for poetry's sake may be even meaningless. Although I'm sure there's going to be some who are going to argue that any poetry can be meaningful. But you've got in your poetry a spiritual dimension where you're bringing into that the presence of God, his divine presence and creation. How significant is it that you actually do encounter God as you're writing your poetry?
Oh, it's highly significant. So I think I actually began poetry more as a devotional exercise than as a writing method. So I've always wanted to be a writer from as long as I can remember, but because I suppose the things I read as a kid were fiction stories, they were the things that I gravitated to. And it was then as an adult when I started, moving out of home, wrestling with, what it meant to be an adult Christian, independent of my parents' faith, that I turned to poetry actually just to process my life myself, both in reading Christian poets, people like George Herbert, John Donne, and how they helped me make sense of my life, but then turning to do it myself. And it was once I realised that exercise wasn't just valuable for me, but that it could benefit others, that I started to think of sharing my poetry.
Is there something really personal that I can ask you around your own family, your identity, the things that have shaped you? Because if we're talking about dormant volcanoes, you didn't mention erupting volcanoes, but for some people, the messiness of their life is a little bit like that. Is this something that you've come from?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of the things that I explore in my poems is, I suppose, the complex stories of our ancestors. There's a series of poems about each of my grandparents. There's a number of poems when I look at some of the diaries and letters of some of my ancestors when they first came to Australia. And so I suppose one of the things that I was drawn to was sometimes the messiness of the stories that we are told about our lives and about the world, and how we then make sense of those in light of God's grace.
Not everyone loves poetry, but there are people who are so passionate about it. Are they of a similar sort of ilk, where you've had all of these competing forces, or people who are familiar with the ways that things can get messy in their lives, and then therefore making sense of those things, seeing something deeper in the poetry? Is there something special? Is there a certain sort of person who just loves to engage in poetic form so that they can reveal that meaning for their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there is a bit of a tendency in our world towards poetry now that I think is a bit more of the self-help genre, where it's a bit more like inspirational quotes, and I think that's probably quite different to, I suppose, the kind of poetry that I'm drawn to. So I had the benefit of being taught poetry when I was at uni by a Jesuit priest who was also a poet, and he just gave me this, I suppose, inspiration to see the way that even the form of a poem could show this longing for eternity, the way that you could shape a poem to represent something that's almost bursting out of itself, something that wants to be eternal, that is stuck on earth. And that just gave me such a wonderful sense of how poetry could be this wrestling with God and this encountering with God. And that's, I think, what we see in the Psalms. We see it in Lamentations, and how so many of the biblical writers, when they are in these complex, messy situations, they turn to poetry as the way of making sense of their world under God.
Interesting, isn't it? I'm just reflecting as you're sharing those things. Psalm 23, he leads me beside the quiet waters. And that sort of harmonious peace of God. You can only talk about that if you've been going through turbulent times. Mm-hmm. Messy and glory don't seem to go hand in hand, but this is something I'm interested in your reflection here. Intentional by God to reflect on the messy so that his glory is revealed. Is that the way you describe it?
I think that's partly what it is. I think it's also the fact that, I suppose, I reflect on how God could, on the moment that we become Christians, click his fingers and transform us into our fully sanctified selves, but he doesn't choose to do that. And I think of the long waits in the Bible. I think of all the periods of time in which God's people have no doubt felt like they have no idea what God is doing, and the times in which people make missteps, and the way that God has chosen to be gracious with that, but also to use that so transformatively. And I suppose, growing up in the landscape I grew up in, I thought of, the violent forces of a volcano making the landscape, and thinking of that being a way that God has shown his glory, because his power is revealed in that. And then also his glory is revealed in the beauty and the peace that can come out of something so tumultuous.
And it would be very rare that someone goes through their life and doesn't experience turmoil and tragedy. And, I'm reminded, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. That transformation, that process, God in the midst of our struggles. And as you've said, God didn't design us that we wouldn't have struggles, but is this one way that he actually reveals himself, that he allows us to struggle and to wrestle, and then in that, he's the one who actually reveals himself to be who he is?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we see that in the Psalms that go through all the, the dark night of the soul, and then arrive at that understanding of God because of what they have gone through. And we'd love to skip to the bit at the end where we just go straight to the peace and the resolution, but that isn't, the saints of the past don't testify to that. They testify to God leading us through the valley of the shadow before leading us to the table he's prepared for us.
Matthew, is there a stanza that you have just continually in your heart, it's just always going around in your mind, that really describes your book for listeners? Is there something you can share with us in the sorts of things you write?
So there is a poem around the middle of the collection called Someday All This Will Be Yours. And And it was a poem that I wrote when I was travelling with my family through Western Victoria. And it's an area that, again, volcanoes, it was shaped by volcanoes a long time ago. And there's a huge amount of rock that's just sort of scattered on the landscape from that. And as we were driving through that landscape, I was reflecting on, my settler ancestors coming to that place and thinking of the, no doubt, kind of darkness of that history, and then thinking of my own family and my children are being noisy and chaotic in the back seat, and then thinking of what I'm giving my children. What is it that my children will inherit from me? And I suppose in the end, the poem is a prayer that, what my children inherit from me will not be this guilt and this turmoil, but that they will inherit grace and they will inherit God's goodness through everything.
Of course, poetry is important because God uses poetry, doesn't he? I mean, when we read the Psalms, and there's a lot of different poetic passages that we can read in the scriptures. And so the ongoingness, writing poetry that's not Bible, but it's poetry that we write, others will read. And ought we to be expecting that, God can use that in a significant way just for inspiration, for helping people? And as you say, you can even use this as a prayer. Is this what you hope people will get from your book?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a lot of ways that the Bible is accommodating for our mess. There's all the prayers in the Psalms that when you feel like you have no words to pray, you can go to the Psalms. But I think sometimes because we live 2,000 years after, much of the Bible was written, sometimes the imagery of the Bible doesn't have that immediacy that it would have for, Israel praying the Psalms. And so I suppose one of the things that I want to give people through my poetry is a kind of an expression of things that perhaps they felt themselves but have found hard to bring to God. And so I would like my poetry to be something that helps them find articulation for the struggles that they feel, and also to see the way that God might be at work also in their mess.
The book is called This Teeming Mess of Glory. Is that the title of a poem in your book?
No, there's no individual poem with that name, but it's an image that you'll find recurring throughout it. So mess, things that are teeming in creation. The source of the title came from the King James translation when it describes God making the oceans and the creatures that teem in the ocean. That was what became my first inspiration there.
Wonderful stuff. And for listeners, if you're drawn to poetry, this might be one you want to get a hold of. It has been shortlisted for this year's Australian Christian Book of the Year, so there's going to be a certain quality about this. It's going to be announced very shortly on the 21st of August, the winner of the Australian Christian Book of the Year. I'm sure, Matthew, you're hopeful that will be you. And others I've spoken to who've been nominated are saying, it won't be me. There's so many other good books that have been nominated this year. But for listeners to get a hold of it, it's called This Teeming Mess of Glory. You can get it via the publisher, Wipf and Stock, or you can get it from online booksellers. You can connect with Matthew on his website, mpullar, Pullar.com. M for Matthew, mpullar.com. Matthew, thank you so much for taking some time to share your heart with us today on 2020.
Thanks very much, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.